Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it is the 24th of March, 2012, and I'm here with Audrey Waters, virtually here with Audrey Waters, to talk about the last 2 weeks in educational technology news. Audrey from Hack Education. Hi, Audrey.
Hello. I missed talking with you last week. So
I did too. Um, I'm, I've decided that this week we're going to end up categorizing everything either as a MacGuffin, a red herring, or a breakthrough.
I think we've got a lot more MacGuffins than breakthroughs. Maybe we'll see.
I, why don't we start in reverse order? Because I thought that particular post, and you got that idea from Stephen Downes, thinking about Khan Academy. Would you explain what a MacGuffin is, and how it actually relates to the core of what's taking place?
A MacGuffin it's a term most often associated with Alfred Hitchcock. He's often credited with inventing it, and it's you can see the MacGuffin often in his suspense movies. So it's the object that sort of, in some ways, initiates the plot. It gets the story going, but it's never actually what the story's about. So one of the most famous examples of a MacGuffin is the bag of money that Janet Leigh's character steals in Psycho. So her her taking that money sort of starts her off on the story. But I mean, if you've seen Psycho, quickly you know that the story becomes about something else. And the way in which sort of Hitchcock builds suspense is initially through the object, but then he moves it to talking about and thinking about human relationships and oftentimes our psychological motivations. And so Stephen Downes just mentioned the MacGuffin in passing in one of the stories on his Old Daily newsletter, and it just struck me as a pretty profound observation about, I mean, obviously about thinking about what is it that gets people started on the story of education technology, of learning, but how much is the MacGuffin sort of not the story, right? And the story has to become, well, I mean, in Hitchcock, but I think I would argue in learning as well, the story has to become about people. It has to become a connection between people, between the audience and what you're learning. And so I thought that, and I think that too often we focus on. I mean, and this is where MacGuffin gets confused with red herring sometimes. Too often we do focus on that object piece, and we seem to forget that that's really just the start of the story. That the MacGuffin isn't the story. It's just a device to get us started.
It was a really brilliant distinction for me, though, because a MacGuffin is a positive. I
Right.
mean, it leads you into something, and I think we'll get into that when we talk about the Audrey test. A little teaser there, but I think if the initiative, interest, desire starts in one place and ends up in somewhere else, then you'd say that's a real positive. Versus a red herring, which really detracts and distracts from the core issues.
Right. I mean, and I think that, I think that there are, I think probably film scholars would probably debate this too. And I think that oftentimes I think we do, especially if we're being critical of some of the gadgetry, particularly if we're talking about an object. Sometimes the gadgetry does feel like a distraction. I mean, and this is something I talk about a lot too. Like, are we talking about shiny objects, or are we talking about teaching and learning? But if you see it instead of as a red herring, as a MacGuffin, then that object should be intriguing enough, right, compelling enough that you're drawn into this narrative that, I mean, ideally, of course, becomes about education.
And there will also be true breakthroughs.
Yes.
So something that may look like a MacGuffin or even a red herring could actually turn out to be a real breakthrough. And I guess the importance would be to kind of be assessing as you go along and making sure that you're not sort of too quickly categorizing something.
Right. I think so.
Okay, Class Connect. This was an interesting story because I keep hearing about Class Connect, and I'm wondering about sharing. We've seen so many sort of lesson plan sharing projects over so many years, and my question is, what's the moment of share? When when is it that people want to share, and is it the lesson plan? And is Class Connect getting something right here?
I think Class Connect is an interesting story for me in a number of ways, partially because the actual the story of the entrepreneur is a really interesting one. Eric Simons is very young. He's I think he's 19, and he has a really compelling story about sort of why he became an education entrepreneur. I mean, it very much has to do with sort of his own struggles in the classroom. But he's been stewing on this idea of his startup for over a year now, and sort of run into a number of obstacles. And but I think he's onto something here with this notion of the of what I call the GitHub for class lessons. And it's a model. It's a model based on a technological solution which allows you to share and version and fork your code. It's always attributed back to the main branch, but because things are openly licensed, you can sort of you can fork it, you can take it down a different path, or you can use it and share it with other people, or you can sort of give back to the original. And it's always attributed, and all of these different versions are tracked. I think it's a really interesting, if he can pull it, he's a whiz. So if he's pulled off this technologically, I think it's a great foundation for people to sort of build upon sort of the ethic of sharing on top of this technology of sharing.
I can tell that it seemed to me that you liked him and liked where this was going. My pushback would be that if you go to a conference, if you go to a place where educators are talking with each other, that the point of share is more at the idea level than it is the lesson plan. Mm-hmm. I don't see educators bringing lesson plans to conferences and swapping them. I'm not a teacher, I don't know, but I worry that we've thought that the lesson plan was the moment of share when I'm not sure it is.
That's interesting. Actually, the what's it called? Prof Hacker, which is the Chronicle of Higher Ed's sort of more techie blog, actually wrote about forking your syllabus the other day. And the syllabus it's not quite the same as the K-12 lesson plan. The syllabus is, of course, like more the overarching sort of narrative of where your class is going. But they talked about sort of the difference between creating a syllabus from scratch, whether it's for intro to American history or cellular biology. But they talked about sort of sharing syllabi, and a tool like Class Connect could be an interesting way of thinking about it in that way too. So tracking what other people are doing in a class, whether it's in the lesson plan level is in a particular day or over the entire class, seeing what other people are doing and then being able to sort of tweak it yourself, but then the other pieces sort of give that back, so that you aren't just the action of sharing isn't just the taking what other people are sharing. It's actually recognizing that that there's a place for you to give back what you've done.
Interesting. Okay, you spoke to Jared Kosulich.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And I loved, this was short, but I love this idea of making things hackable.
Yeah, I thought that this was part of the Mozilla research that I'd done, and Jared had reached out to me saying that he was working on a web-based tool. And what I loved about what he's built, it's called Peanutty, is that it's not just sort of here's how to build something in HTML. It's actually physics-based problem solving that sort of lets you really take apart what happens in the screen, and you can see the code. You can absolutely sort of tweak and play with the code, all in the service of ideally doing solving the problem. But you can also sort of take it in other directions as well. So I thought that this was an interesting way, and particularly using games and puzzles to think about an on-ramp to problem solving, and problem solving with programming.
I think he makes the point that things are get increasingly complex, and as they get increasingly complex, they're harder to hack.
Right.
And it's the hack that sort of is the moment of engagement. I just loved that, thinking about, okay, so how do you take things that long term have complexity in them and build the hack in early? In the same way that the hands-on science projects are kind of early built-in hack.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that the hacking piece is really important. I think that because I think that to me, I mean, I think hacking. Obviously, hacking has lots of definitions, and the name of my blog is Hack Education for a reason. But a hack is something that I think that anybody can do, and it is this powerful thing where you sort of get to seize and adjust and take apart and rebuild things yourself for your own purposes, not because institutions say it should look this way or professionals or the experts say.
So then Laura Blankenship talks about middle school computer science, and especially girls. What did she have to say?
Yeah, Laura and I have been friends for a long time, and she has an interesting background like mine. Her background is in literature, not in computer science, and it's been interesting. I read her blog, Geeky Mom blog, and it's been interesting watching her experiences with the girls who don't want to learn, or how do I want to say this, who seem very resistant to learning the things that I think a lot of us tout as easy. So she was talking about how the students thought that Scratch was too hard, um, and I and so she does spends a lot of time sort of thinking about how do we build sort of creative, problem thinking, curious students when you run up against whether it's an age or the culture that says, I don't want to. I don't. It's too hard. Don't make me think. So,
Which is really sort of that core moment of teaching that's so magical, right? So I
yes.
have an eighth grade girl, and she has an English teacher whom she loves and adores, who's helped her see the magic in literature.
Hmm.
So that would again be an argument for me that that's not a unique moment. That's part of the role of a teacher that
Right.
tech often doesn't really get.
Right. And I think that it's interesting too. She's Laura's teaching a bunch of different grades, and she's the sixth graders that she's teaching actually have had some very basic web building skills, unlike this particular group of eighth graders. And so she just was making some interesting connections about sort of where do we start people thinking about thinking about computational thinking, because according to a traditional computer science, the AP science direction, it's not start. You don't start with the web. You start with Java. You do start with programming. And so, how do we get people on board if the traditional model is something that's not appealing to them, and sort of the easier on ramps to programming don't seem like the right fit.
What is big history?
So, big history is it's a multidisciplinary way of thinking about history, not just human history, and not just sort of history since humans have sort of had the self-awareness to think about their role this way. But it's actually looking at the entire history of the cosmos. So it's history. It's the history of every single thing ever since the beginning of time. It's a new field that sort of blends, obviously, a bunch of different fields, from history and archaeology to biology, climatology, geology, astronomy. And Microsoft created an interesting tool last week, or they released an interesting tool called ChronoZoom. That's a visualization tool that lets you actually sort of move through the history of the universe, if you will, and sort of visualize it. So it's a sort of a first step to sort of how do you even wrap your mind around this concept.
Interesting. More to come, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, talk about Minecraft for the classroom.
Um, I am a huge fan of Minecraft. I will admit that. I love video games, and one of the things love about Minecraft is that it is so open-ended that you can, you really do, it's called a sandbox game because you really are literally building your world. There's no saving the princess, there's no missions to complete, there's no goals, it's open-ended. You can do what you want with a world in which you have to mine the resources and then construct and build your world. So that makes it a really interesting tool for using in the classroom, right up into the point where there are some there's some challenges, I think, if you're going to run your own servers and make a multiplayer environment in the classroom. And so Joel Levin, who has he's sort of at the front of sort of pushing teachers to think about using Minecraft. He's a teacher, and he's actually started his own company to help this process along the way. So he does some consulting. He talks with helping teachers think through how they would use Minecraft in the classroom. But he's also working to build an add-on to make some of these things easier, so to make it easier to launch Minecraft servers. And then he's added a bunch of interesting features too, to sort of, in some ways, I mean, I think this is where it's somewhat controversial. In some ways, it does close. It could be used to sort of close down on those open-ended opportunities with Minecraft. You could have more structured play as opposed to unstructured play. But I think he's helping build out a set of tools to make teachers, or to make Minecraft work better in the classroom. And he does this with second graders.
So a good friend of mine, Alice Keeler, who's a math teacher in Fresno, talks a lot about the value in gaming of achieving levels versus kind of how we typically grade, which is you get a grade on an aspect of a subject and then you move on, maybe without having achieved any kind of mastery. I don't know Minecraft, but from your description, is that value brought through, or is that not addressed as well in this Minecraft for EDU?
It definitely doesn't. I mean, I think that with the Minecraft for EDU, you are able to sort of create assignments and set goals for your students to do. But I would say that the missions that you would set yourself in they're sort of self-driven, self-appointed missions that you'd set in Minecraft. And there are a limited amount of resources. There are really just amazing things that people have built with it. And so it's less about you're going to level up, or you're going to rescue the princess, or you're going to complete these missions, than it is deciding for yourself what you want to build and achieving that.
So I like that. Okay, I had really mixed reactions to your flipping the conference post. Mm-hmm. In part because I feel like this is what we tried to do 5 years ago, or did, I think, with EduBloggerCon, mm-hmm. and with a lot of the unconference activities. And then, especially with our virtual conferences the last few years, with a focus on inclusion rather than on vetted presentations.
Yeah.
So is this a new story, or is it just somebody else kind of discovering this awkward parallel between what happens in conferences and what happens in the classroom?
I would say that, I think that the unconferences get closer to flipping the conference. I think that the virtual conference probably is a gesture in that same way as well. I just get the sense that, I think it is in part the fact that it is very dreary, and speaking from my experience having been to many events now back to back, it's very dreary to go from panel to panel and listen to presentations, and then find at the end, when you have all of these fabulous people in a room, that you really only have 15 minutes to sort of talk, or to hold a discussion, and sort of how do you rethink what happens in when you have people together. I would say the unconference is part of that. I think that having the community come together and decide what the topics to discuss will be, rather than having a formal agenda that you must move through. But I also really liked the idea when you think of flipping the conference, it very much is, or in terms of sort of flipping the classroom, it's assign the homework, the homework, or assign the substance, the readings, the lectures as homework, and when you're face to face, do other things. And so I don't know if there's sort of a way to get more of that, more of the things that we're all supposed to be reading and talking about done ahead of time, so that when we are together, again, you don't have to spend a lot of time covering ground. Everyone already sort of knows what we're supposed to be talking about.
Yeah, of course, I loved the idea. I was like, is there something I'm missing here?
Yeah.
Because this was the big conversation 5 years ago.
Right.
Is it just the connection of the phrasing, from flip the classroom to flip the conference? I mean, it felt like 5 years ago, those of us who gathered for the first EduBloggerCon, we flipped the conference, and we've been doing it, for the last 5 years. I don't know. That was my mixed emotion. Is this really a new story? Okay, so this is sort of, we're discovering that we could actually probably do our regular show in half an hour, because we're sort of have covered a week's worth of posts from you. But we're getting into the news from last week, your roundup news. But what is the lead commission?
What is the lead commission? This is a joke. Sorry for the Department of Ed folks that are listening. So one of the things that made me so excited to back the story up was when the Obama administration back in 2010 released its National Education Technology Plan. Because it was a pretty interesting document that was talking about embracing open source, embracing openly licensed educational content. It was talking about moving to the cloud, kids and their mobile devices. Schools should have high-speed internet. We should be aware of, all of the things that we talk about in terms of sort of bringing forward the technology in the classroom to what perhaps more consumers are accustomed to, right? Always having 24/7 access to via your mobile device. So I thought it was a pretty interesting stake in the ground that the Obama administration was going to support these initiatives. And sort of nothing much has happened. And now, this past week, the government unveiled a website to announce the formation of a commission, the lead commission, to sort of talk about how they're going to develop a blueprint to implement this plan that they wrote 2 years ago. And it just seemed to me like bureaucracy at its finest.
How funny. You also, for the first time last week, and again this week, addressed this issue of Facebook passwords. Last week it was schools demanding a Facebook password. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of frankly stunned by these stories, especially the ones that are coming out of public agencies, and I have a hard time not kind of making maybe sort of too large comparisons with 1984 and Fahrenheit 451. This idea, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't care about sharing your password. What's the trend here? And this just feels really bad to me.
This feels really bad to me, and I think the irony seems to be that here's Facebook, who Mark Zuckerberg has been touting for years now that privacy is done. We need to get over it. There's no more privacy, and now that suddenly the logical extension of that is, okay, well then let's have your Facebook password. Now suddenly this week Facebook has said, no, wait, that's crossing the line, and Facebook is clarifying that you do not. If you hand over your password to someone else, you're violating terms of service, and that they're seeing about ways that they can actually protect users, possibly sue companies that would demand potential applicants or employees hand over that information. So it is a bit of an irony that this company that's sort of laughed at the end of privacy in its terms is now sort of having to become a defender for people's privacy.
Yeah, this one I don't think is over soon, but clearly that people would think it's okay. It would the analogy is for me is would it be okay for someone to come open your mail? Right? I just don't. Why do we think that's okay in the social media world?
Yeah, I don't understand. I don't understand it at all. And I think that in education we've seen conversations around this, whether it's students or teachers, and a couple more school districts now are looking at banning Facebook interactions between students and teachers. And there was a court case this week again about what students post online. Do they have First Amendment rights to post things about teachers online? So I think that I do see that there's a lot of issues around this, but this notion that we should just hand over the keys to any of our transactions, whether they're financial transactions, social transactions, our, like you said, our mail, our email, it just to me seems absolutely unacceptable.
Especially for public agencies. That federal district court ruling in Mississippi, they actually ruled against the students, right?
Right.
That the schools demanding, what did the school demand? To take down the post?
The school suspended a student for posting. He posted a rap song online that talked about some of the coaches at the school, and they suspended him. And we've talked about this before. I mean, it's really not clear what students' First Amendment rights are in terms of their online, what they say online about school, particularly when it's something that they aren't doing on school property. They're not using school internet or school computers to create this content, but that's still about school. And so lots of different rulings across the country about what students' right to free speech, do students have a right to free speech in terms of online content about school. And Mississippi says no.
Well, this didn't hinge on whether or not the allegations of the coaches abusing the girls was accurate. It was just whether or not the students had the right to say anything?
Correct.
Interesting. Okay, Encyclopedia Britannica announces they're no longer going to be creating a print version. The first thing I thought of was this question of whether or not we are actually in an historical moment, right? You made some reference in one post to this, that every generation thinks that they're sort of at the cusp of history.
Yeah.
So does Encyclopedia Britannica stopping the production of their print version give us a clue that we may actually be at the cusp of history?
I'm not sure if we are or not. I mean, and I think a lot of the initial reaction was that, and of course this is I think 250, almost 250-year-old publication that will no longer be printed. So that does make it sound as though it's a historical shift. But I thought that Tim Carmody from Wired, to me, had the best analysis, particularly when people were sort of pointing the finger at Wikipedia, a free online updated in real time encyclopedia as the reason that the Encyclopedia Britannica was shuttering. And he said that it was actually a different sort of shift, and that the shift was that no longer was it a marker of class stature and intellectual stature to have a collection of encyclopedias on your bookshelf at home. The object that people looked to that marked you as a member of the intellectual elite was the personal computer. And so, and the PC was because if remember Encarta and any number, in fact I think Encyclopedia Britannica too, started coming with these other, with lots of CD-ROMs and stuff to put this content in other formats other than the printed book. So if it's a historical moment, I would say it's a historical moment connected to computers, and less this moment today of the web and of the internet. Okay, in the big history scheme, I think it's hard to. Yes, right. It's a historical moment.
Were you making a connection there?
No.
Okay, so TED announces TED Ed, right? The world's greatest teachers. That really reminded me. I've made a connection that I had not made before, and the. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It was about coaching and see if I can find it. But anyway, the story was about a piano teacher who had produced a huge number of piano prodigies. The teacher herself wasn't a brilliant pianist, but she knew how to coach students into becoming really good pianists. So again, anytime there's this sense of we're going to show you the world's greatest teachers, I really have a pause. It just doesn't feel to me like that's a good way of thinking about teaching. What was your response to the TED announcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was my response as well. I think, I mean, in a number of ways. Partially, I think that they're I think that the whole idea of the TED Talks, to me, sort of has a number of problems that I'd like to poke at. It seems to me to be a very elitist event, and I think that the TEDx ones that have sort of sprung out across the country, across the world, are the locally organized ones are a bit different. But the TED event itself seems to be rather an elitist event. And I don't know how much you can do with a 10-minute conversation or a 10-minute lecture. I mean, I think that you can do some pretty entertaining, thought-provoking, interesting things. I mean, I think that there are plenty of TED Talks that I find sort of funny or engaging or compelling to watch. But I'm not sure that I would call that teaching. And I think that if I think of the teachers that have meant the most to me, it wasn't a 10-minute spiel that they gave that was transformative in my own experience with learning. So I feel like there's a disconnect between the things that made me think of my favorite teachers, the world, Audrey's greatest teachers, and is that something that you can put into they said like a 2 to 8 minute animated video. It sort of left me not that excited.
So this form of video, whether it's TED or Khan Academy, MacGuffin or red herring?
Well, I think it's a red herring if we think that that's the end of the story, right? If we think that learning exists if we think that those video content is sort of the end of the story, and that's the story, that's the learning object. That's a red herring. I think it could be a MacGuffin if it makes us think more critically about sort of pathways into engagement, pathways into intrigue,
And pathways into creation.
right?
I mean, I think one of the best things about TED is just the fact that other things have been created. Now, the TEDx for me is a great example of not flipping the conference.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of been my beef with the TEDx's. But a lot of people are involved in the creation process. So for me, that's not necessarily a red herring. It would be a MacGuffin because it actually is leading people to creation, whereas the format of the conference may not be the long-term value, but the creation is.
Yes.
Okay, so how do you really feel about Khan Academy versus Wikipedia Online?
Oh, yeah. I must say the news of Khan Academy releasing an iPad app, was not exciting. Of course, Khan Academy was on 60 Minutes, which I didn't watch. He was on 60 Minutes, I guess it was last weekend. But this wild and uncritical praise for Khan Academy always rubs me the wrong way. And of course, now that with a bunch of headlines that said that now that Khan Academy is on the iPad, that somehow this changes everything and this is opening up access to have more people see the videos. I really
to the masses who can afford an iPad, right? To the great unwashed masses.
Exactly, who weren't able to find the YouTube app on their iPad and find his videos that way, apparently. But no, the Wikipedia piece I thought was really interesting. So this is a new tool that Wikipedia works with. It's called the QX Reader, and it allows it now. They've ported it to the Sugar OS, which is the operating system for the One Child Left Behind devices, and it means that the entire Wikipedia, the contents of Wikipedia, will be available offline for people that use these devices. To me, that's powerful.
Did you just say the No Child Left Behind
devices?
Oh, I did. Did you mean the one? Did you mean the one laptop per child?
I meant one laptop per child. Yeah. No. Yeah. That's funny. That's a little Freudian slip there. Speaking of,
Acronym confusion.
yes.
So that is interesting. Although, sort of fascinatingly for me, having spent years and years evangelizing open source, there's such power in the narrative that sometimes even the most powerfully good ideas struggle just because the narrative of Khan Academy is so strong.
Yeah.
Gates Foundation and Scholastic study 10,000 teachers to find out what they think about their profession. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and sort of depressing too. I think in terms of thinking about sort of just like this lack of um, lack of satisfaction of their job, but then also this fact that teachers are able to recognize the struggles that their students are facing, the things like homelessness, an increase in homelessness, an increase in poverty, that these aren't part of the conversations that that we're necessarily having about why school is not working.
Yeah, I mean, it's such contradictory news coming out of the foundations. That felt to me like the opportunity to really drill down on interesting issues. You then later talk about the Pearson CEO being elected to the MacArthur Foundation.
Yeah.
I just don't quite know how to place these stories in context.
I don't know either. I mean, it's I feel as though there's there's so much work to be done, and it feels as though the things that could be transformative quickly get co-opted. The things that could be interesting quickly become dulled. I'm not sure what to make of all of it either.
Okay, loved the Audrey test post. What is the Audrey test?
Well, this was Greg Wilson from Software Carpentry has been asking me to do this for a while now, and it's based on the notion of the Joel test. Joel Spolsky is the founder of Stack Overflow, which is a pretty popular programming site in which you can sort of go and sort of find like crowdsourced solutions. But Joel has a test that it's sort of a test that he uses to sort of see if your software engineering teams are sort of up to snuff in his eyes. It's a pretty quick 12 yes or no questions, and it's sort of about best practices in terms of developing code, developing your plan, developing your team, making a good place for your team to work. And so Greg's been asking me to write a similar test to Joel's, and it was actually really hard. I've been stewing on it for a long time, but finally I sat down and threw together the things that, and this is based on the things that you and I have talked about before too, of sort of what do we look for when we have conversations with people about ways in which we can tell if they have thought at all critically about what teaching and learning means when they set off down this path to become education entrepreneurs.
I, of course, came up with several of my own, but the one I like best came in your comment section. Somebody said, "What makes you think that you have any clue of what you are doing?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And that would be actually a really good question to ask. I mean, why do you think you actually are bringing value here? And I loved the post. You got pushback.
I did get pushback.
And I thought some of the pushback played right into the story as a whole.
It sure
did. I actually thought some of the other pushback was a little eye-opening and thoughtful to me. What was your response to the pushback?
Well, I thought that some of the pushback, particularly from, I guess, would-be entrepreneurs that did not want to leave their name, not surprisingly, or some did, but they asked me sort of, I think that they didn't even seem to understand what I was asking for. One person I thought said, if this is the sort of reception that I'm going to get in education, maybe I'll work on a different field. And I thought, good riddance, goodbye.
The entrepreneurs did seem to respond in such a way as to indicate that they still don't understand or see the problem.
Correct.
And I'm trying to remember, you made a comparison with some other industry. I can't remember what it was, but you said, what would make you think, bridge building. Mm-hmm. If you'd never built a bridge before and you hadn't studied the history or structural, physics, what would make you think you could jump in and build a bridge? And I think that's a thoughtful message to people. I think they kind of took it the wrong way, that you're excluding us or you're creating unfair and inappropriate barriers. I think actually understanding the context, especially for those of us who really are grappling with what are the purposes of education,
Right.
it's reasonable to ask that you have an answer to those.
Right. I mean, and I think that, this is, I think that this was in some ways the reaction that I got was the test, right? I mean, it was interesting thinking about the people who thought, well, I don't have time to learn this, right? I'm too busy building my company. Or this, to me, like one of the responses, I think that the response on EdSurge was, that's all well and good, but isn't this just the same sort of book learning that's part of the problem? Like, how is this actually make a difference for people who want to do something? And I thought, well, that to me too, that sort of indicates that if you don't recognize some of those names, some of those concepts as having to do with making and building and thinking about how learning works that way, again, you're sort of the reaction isn't sort of the reaction to the test was sort of seemed to me like more of the test itself than actually the minutia of whether or not you know or have thought about some of these questions.
A point that came up in the comments, but I didn't think got fully fleshed out, was the differences in the definitions of success. Meaning, an entrepreneur can say, if I'm iterating, if people are telling me what they want, and then people are buying my product, isn't that success? And actually, I thought that's a good answer, which is if you're an entrepreneur, maybe your job isn't really to figure out the deep complexities of the pedagogy, but just what gets adopted and what doesn't. I mean, that's what entrepreneurs do. But there is that deeper question of what is true success. And sort of the irony for me was, I think it's unlikely you're going to have the short-term success if you haven't actually thought about the deeper success.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, this was a really interesting exercise for me to think through. To think through the things. I mean, to try to put down on paper the things that do run through my mind each and every time I talk to an entrepreneur. And I should say that Steve Silvius from Three Ring had the unfortunate experience of sort of talking with me on the phone. The day I was writing the test, and so he was like, am I going to pass the Audrey test?" I said, "Don't worry about
We'll
it."
get to Steve in just a second. Okay, so you did a post on sort of your thoughts so far on Scratch for HTML5. Kind of where are you at this point?
So I've wrapped up one month's worth of work for Mozilla, and I'm not sure. I'm circling back around with them this week to sort of see what's next, what they think should be next. But it was, the whole process was really interesting to me to have a chance to talk with a lot of educators, and educators both in sort of formal settings and in informal settings, about these questions of you know, about these questions of sort of how do we create more web builders. Everyone seemed to recognize that the problems of web literacy were an issue, but there was so much then. I think the responses were quite fractured then when you asked sort of what do we do about it, and I think that has to be the main thing that I take back to Mozilla. It's despite the fact that I think most people would agree that we really don't do a good job in understanding how the web works. It's whether it's components or building for the web. That there didn't seem to be a lot of agreement about the fact that Mozilla is building a tool to help people learn HTML5 was the right solution at all.
Well, I kind of left that post wondering, should this be something couched within the concept of bringing it into schools at all? Meaning, is this if you have this discussion about what can you do to help youth have a better understanding of the web and their affordances, should it even be a discussion around schooling?
I think that's a really good question, and it goes back to some of the questions that Laura Blankenship was facing with teaching her middle school girls programming as well. And these are the things that I've talked about with several educators too, because there is very little computer science instruction in school in this country. There's some technology skills are taught, sort of using computers, using software, but very little very little CS. And the CS curriculum tends to focus on, it doesn't focus on the web. It doesn't focus on HTML at all, let alone HTML5. It focuses on Java. And so how, like, do we need to then change that curriculum, or like you said, or should we be thinking about ways in which we can support other interests outside the class, outside the school, outside the classroom, or outside the CS classroom too?
Fascinating. Well, we'll look forward to hearing what the next step is. For my Future of Education interview series this week, I interviewed David Warlick,
Yes,
who
I
also
just saw
attended
David. Yes.
the Beyond the Textbook event that Discovery sponsored. And I didn't know I don't know any other way to describe this than that David's perception of textbook funding felt to me like an unholy balance. He said, well, he came out with a renewed appreciation for the role of the textbook, and that that the textbook ends up as a concept providing funding, and that if you get rid of the textbook, you're going to get rid of an enormous amount of funding. And I thought, well, and I kind of challenged them, and I said, well, but if that funding continues to come through, even if it's dollars, if it's being used in the wrong ways, do you even want that funding? Was that just the conversation David and I had, or was that reflected in the larger conversation at the event?
I think that was a conversation between the two of you, and I actually thought that his blog post after the event was really eye opening in that way as well, because that wasn't my takeaway, but I thought that it was a fairly astute one on his part to recognize that Discovery, whose new product is called a tech book, not a textbook, we're having to sort of couch it in terms of textbookness, so they could tap into the allotment, the district, state, school allotment for textbooks. And if and David, I thought, made a very good argument that if we rail against the textbook and say, let's get rid of the textbook, that those dollars aren't necessarily, I mean, we'd be foolish to believe that those dollars, those millions of dollars, will flood back into the school budget. More likely they'll disappear. And so do we have to, like, how can we strategically think about changing what it's purchased, without losing that pool of money, which I thought was an interesting conundrum, and one that I don't know the answer to, and one that I'm not sure that, to me, I'm not sure I'm willing to sort of think about things in that way, because I do think that you sort of repackaging bad practices, that's not fair. Repackaging old practices under sort of new formats isn't sort of new and shiny technology formats isn't necessarily the fight that I'm really interested in waging.
The post is really worth reading. Your post. I need to go back and kind of. I don't think I actually read David's post after the event, but I'm reminded of Gary Steger, who warns us against incrementalism, which is the idea that we can make things better just by making small changes, and that would be my concern. That yes, the intention might be really good, but it still leaves us with this concept of the textbook that I'm not convinced personally is really valuable to us. Yeah. I loved the tweet quotes.
That was one of the things that was really interesting for me about the Beyond the Textbook Forum, which I should think, Discovery flew out, I think, about 20 of us to participate in this day-long event. And the morning we spent talking about sort of what the textbook is, digital and otherwise. And then we had we broke into small groups and talked about what it could be. Like, no holds barred, our imaginations, what would this, if we were to sort of hit the reset button, what would this look like? And I had the fortune of sitting at the troublemaker table with John Becker, Alec Koros, David Jakes, Wes Fryer. I hope Wes doesn't mind me saying he was at the troublemaker table, but he was. And so we had a really interesting and imaginative conversation about what this could be. And then it was really interesting to then to spend the afternoon looking at what Discovery had built and thinking that there is still such a gulf between the sort of imagining what we want and what we have right now in a digital format.
Yeah, I loved Angela Meyer's quote. Was she at the event or just
Yes, yeah.
watching it virtually? She said, "The big shift isn't that content is digital, it's that learning culture is participatory." And I thought that was profoundly incisive for me, although not having been there and not having heard the fuller conversation. Um, okay, so let's move into Three Ring here because this is sort of interesting. I mean, it's somewhat related. It's thinking about tools to aggregate, but in this case, student work.
Mm-hmm.
I kept thinking Evernote. I was reading those. I kept thinking, this is really valuable. Looks very interesting, but could I do this in Evernote? Was that fair? Is there more depth and complexity here?
I think what they've built right now, the answer is probably yes. But I think that what they want to build out eventually is to have more shareable portfolios. And I'm not sure, as it stands, Evernote has that ability to sort of like if you've snapped a bunch of photos or made a bunch of notes in Evernote, you can't then sort of hand over that notebook to. I mean, I guess you can sort of share things publicly. I think that they want to. This is not a lot like Evernote, but I think they want an interface so that teachers can easily scan things, and so that parents and students and administrators can also have a look at these portfolios as well.
Loved the idea. Had two sort of major questions. One was the language around this: gathering student work, staff self and peer assessment, student leading parent conferences. It felt to me like these were practices that didn't necessarily come out of the technology,
Mm-hmm.
and that the promise of the technology doesn't necessarily mean people will use it that way.
Right.
That was number one for me. And the second was, I still feel like this is being driven the wrong direction. I really want this to be parent and student driven, so that this collection over the course of years tips the balance, that the parents and the student go to a teacher and say, here's my collected work over the last 8 years. Here's what I'm really interested in, and here's where I thrive, and here's where I don't. And this felt to me like it still kept things on the wrong side of the equation.
That's actually a really interesting reaction. I mean, I think that my thoughts were too. I mean, I've been seeing a number of tools come out again that are thinking about creating the portfolios, thinking about digitizing student content, and we've talked about this before too. Is like worrying about do the students actually own the content? Do they own the process, or is this something that's being done to their work that then their work sort of again is sort of wrested out of their control into another format?
I agree. Kickboard, a
Yes.
data dashboard for teachers, the two sides of data,
Mm-hmm.
right? I keep coming back to Deming, right? Deming helped us to understand the need for the frontline worker to know how to manage data and how to have that impact their processes. But it also feels like there was a recognition of the necessity of simplicity.
Yeah.
And I looked at Kickboard and I thought, I've seen so many projects, educational and otherwise, that try and put everything in one place.
Right.
And my thought is that's just not going to happen.
That's my I think that particularly as the buzzwords around data, the stakes get higher and higher. I mean, I am really interested in finding ways that for one thing, that we can track data that isn't just about test scores and numbers, right? I mean, data doesn't necessarily mean numbers. Data is any sort of qualitative and quantitative stuff that happens in the classroom. So I love the idea of having better tools to sort of be able to jot down all of the things that happen that matter, that might give us more insight into a student. But I think you're precisely right. Once you've done that, you've actually built something that's rather cumbersome, and you know, Rafael Corrales, who's the CEO of LearnBoost, I remember when I first talked to him about his grade book, that he said that his biggest competitor wasn't Pearson. His biggest competitor was the pencil and paper, and I think that I think that if pencil and paper is going to win against Kickboard every day, because even if you've got notes jotted down on sticky notes and in a variety of different places, that until it's actually easier to put it into a computer interface, to track it in some sort of software program, I just don't think that we're going to pay attention to the sort of rich things that occur, and we really are only going to put into the interface the numbers and the grades, and we'll sort of end up with the sort of same problem that we continue to face, which is this obsession over assessment.
I kept thinking it's not a tool problem, it's a training problem. The tool is easier to solve than the training, but it felt to me like that's the core is understanding the value of data and how that relates to specific helping in learning. And the tool is easy to build, even a tool that has promises like Kickboard. Mm-hmm. But I kept coming back to it's about the training or the perspective rather than the tool.
Yeah.
Okay, hey, we're almost done. We've talked about the federal district court ruling. However, we haven't talked about the fact that the state of education could be a threat to our national security.
Yeah, this is chilling to me. The Council of Foreign Relations released a report this week, penned, and I think that this speaks volumes, penned by Condoleezza Rice and Joel Klein. Klein is the former chancellor of schools, New York Public Schools, and he now works for Rupert Murdoch's News Corps. So they penned a report that talked about national security, and they listed our school system as a threat to national security. Our failing schools, the lack of our failure to turn out people who understand the STEM fields in particular, that students are not going to be that are not sort of workforce ready, and this is a national security threat. And I think that I'm deeply troubled when we label things as a national security threat, because I think that then all sorts of other political practices kick in that I don't think we want anywhere near our children, let alone our teachers, schools, etc.
We'll just let there be a little pause, a silent pause.
Is this
there.
a Mike Daisy pause, like on?
Right. What did the new Pew study tell us about smartphone use of teenagers?
I mean, it's not surprising that teens continue to be text messaging fiends. Girls in particular send and receive almost 100 texts a day, the median number of texts, and that they're smartphones. Although I think they're still seen primarily as something that adults possess. More and more teens do have smartphones, and I think that we're seeing the Android phones come down and be incredibly. If you have a data plan, it's pretty easy to get your hands on an Android phone for fairly cheap. And so teens are definitely becoming smartphone users, but they are still text messaging. They're not necessarily whole-scale abandoning texting for other ways of communicating through apps.
And again, part of what I hope we're learning is that learning is social, or being reminded of it. And these are social tools. And of course, they're being used because they fill a social value to the students, to the youth. And hopefully we'll be able to begin to figure out that social value is worth really looking at carefully in terms of learning. Teach for America's effectiveness. Is this something new? That didn't feel new to me. I thought we kind of knew that Teach for America teachers weren't necessarily any more effective than other teachers.
The Schenker blog always does some really interesting look at politics around educational data, and they took a sort of a deep dive into the rhetoric around TFAs. These are highly qualified, highly intelligent students, and so therefore, so the logic goes, they are more effective teachers. And I think that the article just sort of pushed back on that notion and said that really they don't do any better than other teachers do in terms of teaching.
Which is not Teach for America's message, right? I mean,
Right.
their message is, as I hear their message, it is that they're learning really valuable things about how to create successful classrooms in dysfunctional schools.
Right.
And so this would say that maybe they're not.
Right. Correct.
And to end on a really high note,
Yeah.
the Pearson CEO is elected to the MacArthur Foundation Board of Directors. Are we all cheering?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, there goes our genius grant, Steve. We'll never get one now.
Yeah, I'm not sure I was ever in the running. Audrey, thanks so much. 2 great weeks. I have to tell you, I always enjoy reading these posts. I feel like it's kind of the highlight of my week. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you. That's very flattering. This is great. I really missed talking with you last week, and I come across things and I say, I can't wait till Steve and I get to talk about it. So.
Have a great week.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye.